Hi, let's talk about collective action frames in social movement theory. Just to recap a little bit about the history of social movement theory and where framing fits in, up until the mid-1970s, social psychology dominated social movement theory. Totally separate from that, in 1974, Irving Goffman published a book called Frame Analysis. But right at that time, the dominant social movement theories were changing to be ones more based on economics and politics, like resource mobilization theory and political process theory. So at that point, they were really about what's happening out there in the world, not what's going on inside people's heads. A quote from this time period is, or rather a quote about this time period, is the macro forces of politics and organization were seen as creating the structures and resources that enabled people to act collectively, while the link between objective conditions and subjective perceptions or grievances was seen as unproblematic. This all starts to change in the early 80s. People started to say, it really actually does matter what happens inside people's heads. We should actually think about that. And in 1982, Gamson publishes a paper coining the term injustice frame, which we'll talk a little bit more about. It doesn't quite take off that big yet, but then in 1986, David Snow and some collaborators published an article on framing. They took the idea from Goffman. They're also taking Gamson's idea, and at this point, it just takes off and remains important to this day. By 1997, one of David Snow's collaborators, Benford, wrote, "In short, the term frame has become a cliché in the study of social movements." In terms of framing's theoretical roots, Goffman was responding to William James's question, under what circumstances do we think things are real? Snow and his co-authors wanted to know how collective actors go about the business of socially determining what is it that's going on here, and by extension, how movement actors seek to sway others that their collective definitions of the situation are right and reasonable. The way social movements use framing is they're trying to motivate other people to join them and do whatever it is they need them to do. Come to the protest, donate money, sign a petition. To do this, they're using framing to tell people this is what the problem is, this is what caused it, this is the solution to it, and here's how you can help. Here's an official definition. A frame is an interpretive schemata that simplifies and condenses the world out there by selectively punctuating and encoding objects, situations, events, experiences, and sequences of actions within one's present or past environment. Frames thus enable an individual or group to locate, perceive, identify, and label events within their life space and the world at large. Before collective action is likely to occur, a critical mass of people must socially construct a sense of injustice. The consequent injustice frame is the seedling for the development of a collective action frame. Snow and Benford define collective action frames as emergent action-oriented sets of beliefs that inspire meaning and legitimate social movement activities and campaigns. Collective action frames underscore and embellish the seriousness and injustice of a particular social condition or redefine as unjust and immoral what was previously seen as unfortunate but perhaps tolerable. An example of this that they give is that at one point people thought drunk driving accidents were just sad, but they were accidents, it just happens. And then this got reframed. Some immoral person who shouldn't have done this, drank, got into their car, drove, and now people are dead. That was an immoral thing to do. It's not fair that somebody died because of a different person's immoral action. And so at that point, it's not just something sad, it's something that is wrong that we need to do something about. This is a quote from Gamson. It's from 2013. Gamson coined the term injustice frame in 1982, so it's the same person who coined the term, but this is his thinking about it many decades later. He said, "We may think it dreadfully unfair when it rains on our parade, but nature is a poor target for an injustice frame. When we see impersonal abstract forces as responsible for our suffering, we are taught to accept what cannot be changed or make the best of it." At the other extreme, if one attributes undeserved suffering to malicious or selfish acts by clearly identifiable persons or groups, the emotional component of an injustice frame will almost certainly be there. Concreteness in the target, even when it is misdirected, is a necessary condition for an injustice frame. Hence, competition over defining targets is a crucial battleground in the development or containment of injustice frames. More specifically, an injustice frame requires that motivated human actors carry some of the onus for bringing about harm and suffering. So when I read this, I thought about Hurricane Katrina. If this was just an act of nature, who are you going to be mad at? It's terrible that there was a hurricane and people died, but that's life. People got angry when they realized the human component, that the levees broke and the response was really botched. People were to blame for all of the suffering that happened in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. There's 3 types of frames: diagnostic, prognostic, and motivational. Diagnostic identifies the problem and attributes blame. Prognostic identifies the solution to the problem, and motivational is a call to arms, a rationale for collective action. So here's an example that has all 3 of these components. The backstory is that right around the US-Mexico border, there's a small population of jaguars, and the border wall is going right through their territory. It is cutting off the Mexican population from the US population, impeding gene flow. I took this from the Center for Biological Diversity's website, right off the front page, and they're telling you, here's the problem, that it's hurting the jaguars. The solution, we don't want a wall, and you need to help us in order to achieve that. Just an FYI, an older concept to framing is ideology. Ideology is not gone. It's still around. Framing is more dominant, but ideology is still a thing. I took a quote here from 1973, long before framing came about, and it says that ideology also contains 3 parts: a diagnosis of the problem, a solution, and a rationale for the movement. So that's very similar to these 3 types of frames. A couple other good framing vocab words: master frame. This is a big overarching frame that other smaller frames fit into. So everybody already has an injustice master frame in their head. If there's an injustice in the world, it needs to be righted. If you can plug your movements frame into that master frame, then it's already going to help people make sense of what's going on here. Counterframe, when one group creates a frame to counter an opposing group's frame. So the example I took here, the environmental movement's framing of pesticides is that they're toxic, so maybe we shouldn't use them so much. The pesticide industry, which frames itself as the crop protection industry, says no, they're necessary to prevent world hunger. So you can see how these 2 frames are competing, because on one hand, yeah, it's probably not good to put toxic chemicals on food, but on the other hand, maybe if that's necessary to save hungry, starving people's lives, then maybe we should do it anyway. The big 1986 paper that made framing take off was about a concept called frame alignment. So for framing to work, it needs to resonate with people. People are not going to mobilize and join your movement unless the frame resonates. And so this paper is about 4 different processes that movements use in order to bring their frames into alignment with the people that they're trying to mobilize. Don't get too hung up about these 4 different vocab words here: frame bridging, amplification, extension, and transformation. But I'm going to show you examples and just notice how the different movements are working to bring their frames into alignment with the people they want them to resonate with. So here's an example of frame amplification. This is an actual example that David Snow and his collaborators wrote about. There was a homeless shelter by the Salvation Army that was proposed in a neighborhood, and some people in the neighborhood did not want the shelter. And they were just like, what do we even do about this? Because it's a charity, charity is good. The Salvation Army is a religion, religion is good. How do we say anything bad about that? And then they came up with it by amplifying a pre-existing value and a pre-existing belief that people have. The value was that crime is bad, and the belief is that homeless people might be criminals. So they said, we don't want this homeless shelter because we don't want to bring crime to our neighborhood. And this actually worked. They prevented that homeless shelter from moving in. This is another one. This is called frame extension. The peace movement is already trying to bring people in by saying we want peace, we don't want war, we should cut the defense budget. That's already going to resonate with some people, but now they're extending it so that it will hopefully resonate with more people. They say, you know what, we spend so much money in the US on defense. We're not spending that money on environmental and social programs. It's a trade-off. We only have so much money to spend, and we're giving it all to the military. So if you want environmental and social programs, you need to join the peace movement and help us cut the defense budget. And they're hoping that this is going to bring more people into their movement. I have two examples of frame transformation. This is one. To quote Snow et al.'s 1986 paper, what was previously seen as unfortunate but tolerable becomes seen as unjust, inexcusable, and immoral, or what was a problem previously attributed to one cause is now attributed to another. That's what a frame transformation is. And in both cases, now this transformation can necessitate action. So one example comes from the Black Lives Matter movement, and I'm quoting sociologist Rashawn Ray here. The old frame that many people had is that when an individual police officer kills an unarmed person, that's sad, but that cop was just a bad apple. And in that case, what are you going to do about bad apples? Maybe you could have better screening processes. Maybe you could prosecute that one guy. Maybe you could have disciplinary action of some sort. But Rashawn Ray says, no, they're from a rotten tree. Well, if the whole tree is rotten, you can't just take care of these bad apples individually. Now you need systemic change. This is another actual example. Starting in the 1980s, members of hate groups like the KKK openly admitted that they were pursuing a frame transformation to try to bring more people into their hate groups. They were finding that their open message of hate just wasn't resonating with people anymore, and they decided to try a new tactic by saying, we're not about hate, we're about love. So in this article I'm quoting here, there's an earlier quote from this Nazi who's like, yeah, I hate people. And a few years later, he's again now talking about how he doesn't hate people. He says, hating someone simply because they're another color is stupid, and I do not advocate that. But the racism that says I love my own and I want to preserve my race, that is noble, that is honorable. So you can see the frame transformation here, and they're doing this. They were actually very open about why they were doing it, to try to draw more people into their cause. What makes a frame resonate? Credibility and salience. Is this frame consistent? Does it check out with your lived experience? Are the people who are doing the framing credible? So if Anthony Fauci says something about the coronavirus, you'll probably believe him. But if somebody you see walking around at Target says something, you probably won't believe them as much. Does it speak to your values, beliefs, the ideas that are most important to you? Does it fit with your everyday experience? Does it fit in with your culture? An example of this with the reframing of hate groups. A couple years ago, there was an effort to start all these Facebook groups, supposedly from different college campuses, for white student organizations. And all of the official wording on the Facebook groups was about how these are not hate groups. Every different ethnic group gets to have their own organization, and this is just the one for white people. You know, shouldn't we be allowed to have our group too? But then if you actually went into the groups, you would see people using racial slurs and saying openly hateful things. So if initially that framing appealed to somebody like, oh, I am white, I'm proud of myself for being white, I want to be with other white people, you go into the group, you see all these racial slurs, it's just obvious that their framing is not true, that this really is just a hate group. And you're only going to stick around if you really actually want a hate group, otherwise you're going to leave. So that's everything I have for you on collective action frames, and in the next video I'm going to talk to you about transnational advocacy networks.